When I was 6 or so, we lived in this rural part of the South. If you think of that perpetual smell of shit and death, that buzzing sound that was too loud to be considered insects but too small to be considered birds, and the air was so disgustingly hot, yet wet that your face never truly dries, you are imagining my home. Ryan was younger than me, by just shy of 10 months. My parents wanted a big family and they loved having kids. Before me, they fostered a lot of children. Until Ryan and me were around 4 and 5, they continued to foster. Dad got a job in the middle of nowhere at this military base and they decided to focus on us for a while. Ryan was always the type to follow me everywhere and do whatever I suggested. He was enamored at me, and that always left me with a bit of guilt. You see, I showed him the lights in the back of the house. Back when we were kids, we played outside until it was dark, sometimes even longer. Once a week, there would be these lights that were in the woods behind our house, well behind the thickest of the bushes. Our parents could never see it from the house. We would go there and stare at them. The lights were several neon green orbs that were so perfect it hurt my teeth to just look at it. I still get phantom pains thinking about it. It smelled of a sweet syrup whenever they appeared and returned to the rotting stench the second they were gone. The most uncomfortable part of the lights was the fact that it changed how I felt. I became unfathomably happy. Since then, I've indulged in some illicit substances, the hardest you can guess. And they were still a dull facsimile to how those lights made me feel. They only appeared once a week, and not always the same time each week. They were always the same, until they changed. One night, Ryan and I raced to the woods. He was never really fast enough for me, always lagging behind or tripping on the smallest of grass. Had it been any other time, I might have stopped out of kindness, but that night, I was just so annoyed. He cried out for me, but I didn't listen. I couldn't. Could you blame me? We only had so long before our parents wanted us home, and I wasn't going to miss out on a single second of the lights. There they were, remarkable and glowing. Alone, they seemed brighter, more special. It felt like this was just for me. I was pulled closer, as if a hook plunged into my chest, my hand stretched out. If I got close enough, maybe I could pluck one of the glowing orbs that made up the lights from the air. Maybe things might have turned out differently if I had stopped for Ryan. Maybe I wouldn't have felt the shift happen in my bones. The childish anticipation turning into need. As I came closer, the lights went from green to yellow, the sweet smell turning sickly. My fingertips buzzed like I was holding one of those back massagers from the mall. I heard Ryan behind me, panting as he caught up with me finally. "Hey!" Ryan called. "You're bleeding!" I sniffled and felt something trickling down, out of my nose. I remember the blood looking weird that night, already clumping together. That scared me enough to go home, dragging Ryan behind me. I wiped my nose on my shirt, hoping my mom didn't notice it on my bright red t-shirt. I can remember lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, with the lights firmly in my forefront of my mind. The smell that permeated the air as I reached out for them still coated the inside of my nose and throat. When I closed my eyes, I could see the shift they had made from green to yellow. The buzzing that had gone through my fingers spread throughout my whole body as my mind stayed firmly fixed on the memory. I had been so close. They were right there. I was too young to grasp the concept of addiction at that time, but looking back on it, I was hooked. I tossed and turned most of the night, My legs felt restless, and each breath seemed to bring a hollow ache to my chest. Frustration built in me with how long I would need to wait to see them again. Worse, I thought of how my brother had interrupted my chance to touch something so wonderful. Of course, now I can see clearly that it wasn't all his fault. He simply snapped me out of my trance by telling me I was bleeding and bringing me back to reality. I could remember the sight of the thick clotted blood on the back of my hand, and it made me feel uneasy. For some reason, I chose to fixate the blame for this being on my brother. I don't know if it was due to my child's mind twisting the situation, or if it was because those lights seemed to have such a powerful influence over me. I hissed his name through my teeth and squinted my eyes as if he was standing right in front of me. I was scolding him. I swung my legs out and got up. It was late and the house was deathly quiet, aside from my father's distant snores down the hall. I crept slowly towards my brother's room, being careful not to step on any loose boards. Ryan and I both had learned all their locations while sneaking to the kitchen for midnight snacks. I stood in the open doorway and stared at him. I clenched my fist so tightly that I could feel my fingernails digging into the palm of my hands. The hollow aching feeling in my chest was even more intense, and that endless stink of rot and shit that always hung in the air of the place seemed more intense than ever. I looked at his body lying beneath the blankets, bathed in the soft blue of his nightlight. And regardless of how I feel now, all I knew was that I wanted him gone. Gone forever. It didn't even register with me that my nose had started bleeding until the drop rolled over my lips and down onto my chin. I wiped it away with the back of my hand. It was less thick than before. It did, however, look almost black in the dim glow of the hallway. Suddenly, I felt a hand squeeze my shoulder and heard my father's voice from behind me. "What are you doing out here, son?" Nothing. I quickly stammered out a reply and scrambled back into my room. Whatever trance I was in, Dad had snapped me out of it. I still didn't sleep that well that night, or any other night for the matter of fact. For the next week, I could only get around 4 hours of rest a night. My senses were filled with the sight of the shifting colors, the syrupy smell, and the odd warmth I felt when I got closer to the lights. There were birthday parties I didn't remember as vividly as this. The lights consumed almost every single thought that wasn't about them. I couldn't focus on schoolwork. I failed a spelling test because I forgot halfway through it. If I felt addiction before, then this was withdrawal. It was Friday night when I could faintly see the lights through the bushes. Strange, I thought. I'd never seen them through anything before. The second I saw them, I decided I wasn't going to deal with this for another week. I was going out to the lights, alone. I instantly planned a trip to the lights like it was a prison break. I knew how to get out of the house silently. I knew how many steps exactly to get to the bushes. I kept thinking of how to get there with a minimal wasted movement as possible. But as I got closer, it disappeared. I waited too long. I'd have to wait again. I was so angry it hurt. I had thought it was withdrawals before, but this letdown was the truest understanding of how bad jonesing could be. There are few drugs that can actually kill you from withdrawal. I wasn't, and I'm not still sure if being away from the lights could actually kill, but it did feel like it. Being 6 or so and in kindergarten, class was a little more than coloring and singing, but even that was set to 0. Everything was faded and unimportant. I didn't care to do anything, and the teachers started to notice. My parents were called before the first week without the lights. They didn't understand what was wrong and wanted me to see a therapist. I couldn't care. I was aching. I had headaches often. I was becoming aggressive. Since then, I've been addicted to a few other things, and they were nothing compared to this experience. It was painful to even live. Fortunately, I didn't have to wait long. It was Thursday, and I was compelled to look out the window just before dusk, and then I saw it. I was ready. I snuck out that night and made my way to it. Without Ryan there, things felt different. I think the best analog is how you smoke something, it heads well, but if you shoot it, then there's no going back. The delusion was gone. I felt the hit of the lights at full bore. It felt perfect. It also was terrifying. Something was noticeably different. The sounds were more intelligent and focused. I heard unearthly voices that created a pulling sensation in my head. It pulled me to look up at the trees. I felt nauseous. I couldn't pull away. Everything was colored and electric. I saw colors I didn't know existed and I was lost. I was pulled out of Earth. I was in a place that was so utterly anti-Earth that it could have only been described as other. All around me were sounds and colors and sensations that didn't register correctly in my brain. Throughout it all, I heard a repeating tone that held an animosity towards an enemy. I couldn't figure out who this enemy was before I heard the shouting. Dad was outside with Ryan. His flashlight was shining at my face, and he was shaking me. He rushed me to the hospital with my mom crying and holding Ryan. They thought I was having seizures or some sort of brain tumor. The doctor threw a battery of tests at me. They found trace evidence of heroin abuse, but different. How could a child get drugs, they asked. The police came in at that point and searched the house. The FACS wasn't far behind, but nothing came up. My parents both tested clean. During the weeks of these developments, I was convalescing in bed, but I kept being pulled to the lights. They didn't show up for a while, and I was afraid they were gone at last. In my recovery, I understood only one thing. I found who the enemy was. My goddamn brother, Ryan. I was a child, but I had the anger of a man. I hated that son of a bitch. My parents and the doctors were perplexed at how my detox went, considering I had nothing to detox from. My bed was next to a window that faced the lights, and every night I looked outside as I tried to sleep from my medications. I hadn't seen a thing for weeks at a time. Then, the dream started. I was on another planet where plants replaced buildings. They grew and moved as if they were smarter than even our best animals on Earth. I remember feeling innately safe. It was my truest home. Then I heard a voice. Music, my whole life, had a special quality to me. It wasn't just the sound and notes, but it was reverberation of my soul. No one could understand it nor appreciate it the way I did. That started with a voice. It didn't say words, but it pushed me with sounds, nudging me like how the tide would move a sheet of paper. Still, I knew exactly what it craved, without a single cogent word. It wanted Ryan. He was the enemy, and it wanted to destroy him. The next night, the lights returned. Unlike before though, they didn't disappear at daylight. When the sun came up, I still saw them there. Dull and faded, but still there. I wasn't sure how to do it until fate turned into my favor. I heard my parents say Ryan was sick and had to stay home for school. I knew my parents were comfortable enough with the neighborhood to leave us alone for a few hours, even as young as we were, to get medicine and lunch. I was ready. The lights would get him. I'm not proud of what I did. Don't think that for a second. I was young, but I knew I was evil. He was sick, on the last bit of cold medicine we had that sent Mom to the store, and he trusted me. I had no idea what the lights would actually do with him. I just had to deliver. I saw them beckoning me behind the house. I would make them so very proud. It took minimal coaxing because even while being deathly sick, Ryan still wanted to play. I tugged his hand the entire way there and he protested in a low tone. "I'm tired." "I hurt," he whined. "We're almost there," I offered. "It'll make you feel better." "Didn't it make you sick?" "Come on." I think he was crying from my pulling so hard. It didn't matter to me. My eyes were locked on my goal. When we got to the lights, we had a very different reaction. I was a junkie getting my fix. Ryan was watching a horror monster come to life. His reaction was probably the most correct. It was moving and changing as if it was physical. I even noticed it felt more concrete. Ever since my childhood, I would never hesitate with things. If I were with friends on a cliff deciding to jump, I'd jump onto the water before anyone else could. I got the reputation as someone who was fearless, but I think this moment trained me. With a small shuffle, I stepped behind Ryan and I pushed him into the light. In seconds, I was seized again by an unseen force. I screamed, I think. Though I felt like my body was shattering to a non-corporeal state, I felt lifted by small orbs of lesser light that fed off my essence. I became made up of particles and joined in their caterwauling and dancing around that was my brother. Brian's experience was far less pleasant. He instantly began to bleed from his eyes, ears, and mouth. He was lifted into the air and began to gasp in pain, as if he was being suffocated. In his flying, he turned to me. The pain in his eyes was dwarfed by the hatred of me betraying him. That turned to horror as I too changed into something more. I became a cloud of consciousness rather than a single entity. In that moment, I became the lights. It felt perfect and holy and glorious. Then, the cloud converged on Ryan, and I blacked out from the overabundant sensations. I woke up in bed, maybe an hour after the entire experience. I was sure I was just taken by a fever dream until I went to check on Ryan. After what I saw, I fled back to my room. What I found was confirmed by the shrieks of terror from my mother. In my little brother's bed was a gray, drained husk of a child. It may have been him. I was too young to recall if that was confirmed. It didn't look like any human I'd ever seen. In the weeks after he died, we'd moved to get away from all of it, but it was the end of my family. My mother and father fought all the time. They both knew I had something to do with it. I was too happy all the time. I moved and acted differently than they'd ever recalled. I wasn't a child who lost his brother. I was someone who found their first love. They would always stop talking when I entered the room, and neither of them would be alone with me. It wasn't long before they divorced. I had to live with my dad, but he was working so much, as if Ryan's death precipitated his workaholic mentality, that I was eventually taken into foster care. Years after, I got less happier. It's like the first shot of heroin. You always want to reclaim that state of perfection, but it never comes. So you use more and more, but you never get there. That's where I am now. See, I started to see the lights in my new town, deep in the woods. I've managed to travel a lot. by the way of my odd jobs. But now I found it. I can't stop thinking of it. I'm going to give in. I can't help it. But the question I have is, who does it want now?